Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jace Booker. Today I will be presenting a case study for Should Dan Blow the Whistle? This case asks us to decide whether employee Dan Goldberg should report illegal environmental pollution committed by his own company. Throughout my presentation, I will be trying to use ethical theories from Chapter 4, which included direct eurism, preface-based eurism, economic eurism, and indirect or rural eurism. By applying these theories to some of the facts of my case, I try to explain why I believe Dan should report the pollution, even though it could cost him everything. It could cost him his job, could cost him, just everything. And let's head on to the next slide. All right, so the first question I ask is, what is this case about? I feel like that's the best way to start it off. So, what the heck is this case about? Well, it follows this guy named Dan Goldberg. He is a cost accountant for Pear Tree Plastic Corporation. As his job as a cost accountant, it means his job is to examine production costs and help the company understand where the money is being spent, and how is it being spent, how can they decrease the amount of spending and increase the production. That's his main job. His manager Sheila tells him, "Hey Dan, go look at this company in a factory called Thornbrook Factory in Canada, Ontario, Canada." So while Dan's reviewing reports from this factory, he noticed that the production costs are much lower than every other factory he has visited. And Dan at first, like, wow, this is amazing. We need to do what they're doing here to the other factories. But, however, Dan discovered that the factory is cutting costs by illegal dumping toxic mercury waste into nearby lake instead of paying for proper disposal. They just dump it in the lake. They're being lazy about it. Pretty much this case explains that this pollution threatens, wildlife, the people that's living nearby the factory, they drinking water, contaminates the fish, property values, even just the people in general. And Dan contemplates, like, should I tell my supervisor, Sheila Dunsworth? Should I just leak it? Should I just not say anything? And Dan really contemplates these things, and he doesn't really know what to do. And pretty much it asks, should Dan remain silent or become a whistleblower? And I feel like he should, and I'll explain why. I feel like he should speak up and say something, and I'll explain why throughout this case. Next question: who is infected? Well, that's a great question. One of my main points, the first point is eurism. Eurism is pretty much requires us to consider everyone is affected. Pretty much what that means that everyone is important, and we should consider everyone. Before really applying this theory, it's important to identify the main people affected. Like, for example, in this case, Dan, I feel like Dan is really affected as well because he can lose his job, he can lose his livelihood. So many factors that if he speak up, he can lose so many things. If he doesn't, he can still lose things. He can get fined for not telling anyone. So many different factors. I feel like even Sheila and the company executives are affected because they may face legal consequences if somebody speak up or the people find out what the heck they're doing. They can get fined by the government. They can get, it's so many different factors. They can really be in a lot of consequences. Even the factory employees I consider affected because the factory people are working at the job. They constantly exposed to this toxic mercury. They can get sick. They can lose a job once people find out, or if Dan speaks up, people can lose a job or whatever. There's so many different factors. One of the biggest ones, I would say, the biggest group that's really affected is the people. The people living near this factory. The family that's drinking that water from the lake, or even drinking the clean water, but it's affected by the mercury. They can get sick. They can get mercury poisoning. It's very toxic to humans and animals. If consuming that, they can get cancers. They can get birth defects. It's so many different factors from mercury by these people drinking this water. I say the fishermen that rely on these lakes to get food and fish, they can get affected as well, and it's a big problem because if people consuming the fish that they getting from this lake, they gonna get sick. It's so they gonna get really really sick. I'll say the wildlife is also affected as well, because the animals that drinking from this water can get sick. Even the hunters that hunt these animals are going to get sick by these affected animals, and that's the big thing. And I just want to say that mercury contamination can affect future generation. You know, they can inherit, like I said, birth defects, cancers. It's so many different factors from mercury poisoning. You know, it's very, very toxic. And even just for the environment, like the trees, the grass, it can kill so many things, you know. And Euroism reminds us that every person well-being matters equally, not just the interest of the company. So by the company only caring about them, they affecting so many others, you know. They're affecting so many people in the community just because the company want to save money and be lazy. All right, on to the next slide. Direct Euroism. So I'll explain what this is. So pretty much what direct Euroism is, uh pretty much um evaluate each action by its own consequences. So, for example, the goal is maximize over happiness while minimizing suffering. You know, like for example, if Dan stays silent, let's give you the pros and cons. If Dan stays silent, the company saves money because it avoids paying for hazardous waste disposal, and Dan more than likely probably gonna keep his job if he doesn't speak up, right? And some of the more pros of this is, you know, Dan saves money. You know, he keeps his money. You know, keeps a job. He doesn't have to worry about getting fired or anything like that. The company avoids fines because nobody finds out that they illegally dumping waste into a lake. So they keep money. They don't have to worry about the government giving them fines. But however, the cons are pollution continues. People are still gonna keep getting sick, and it's just gonna keep happening if nobody knows. And public health still remains at risk. You know. Um, and I'll say, and then for the cons, if Dan report, excuse me, not the cons, but some of the pros of the next thing is if Dan reports it, if he doesn't say something, if Dan reports the pollution, the company may face fines, and Dan may experience retaliation by like being fired or get a fine for by the company by exposing them, you know. And but however, the positive is stop pollution, you know, stops illegal dumping in the lake. You know, public health is protected, future environmental damage can be prevented, you know, protects the drinking water. When people drinking the water, they don't have to worry about being poisoned. It stops the poisoning. It holds the company accountable as well. Like if they get exposed, the company has to deal with that, has to start following the laws and rules, you know, prevents future harm for the people living there, you know. Also, another thing, however, you know, although reporting, you know, creates a short-term cost, the benefits extend more for. So even though it reports it to the government, if Dan speaks up and report it, you know, if Dan reports it, it's gonna help the people out. It's gonna help the environment because the company are now held accountable. You know? Sorry, I'm kind of sick. My fault, guys. Therefore, you know, to summarize it, you know, direct Eurozone supports it, you know, reporting to pollution. So it supports reporting it. All right, move on to the next slide. Preface and economic Eurozone. So preference-based Eurozone pretty much just says, what would informed people prefer? So like if you knew all the facts and all the cons and you had to make a decision, what would you prefer? So I'm pretty much thinking that most people prefer clean drinking water, safe food, you know, not toxic food like fish or whatever from the lake. You can eat it and while getting sick. Healthy ecosystems, like I said, like the animals and stuff surrounding it. And let's say you hunting it and you won't get sick or anything. Honest business, make the company. You know, we want the company to be honest what the heck they are doing. You know, and companies that just obey laws. I feel like that would preference based tourism people will prefer. You know. However, economic Eurozone really focus on short-term costs like the cleanup, the fines. You know, companies like, oh, the cleanup is easy. We just jump in late, or fines, we won't even get fines. Lower profits. You know, they also think about long-term benefits. You know, they want to avoid lawsuits, protect public trust. You know, really prevent environmental damage and encourage responsible business practices. That's what economic tourism will want. Pretty much the benefits, goodness, not the bad stuff like dumping in it. They want like good stuff. And and sorry if this doesn't make sense. I'm gonna re-explain it. Actually, let me re-explain it. Preference-based tourism asks what if foreign people would choose if they, understand all the facts. Most people prefer safe drinking water, clean lakes, businesses that operate, honestly, rather than companies increase the profit through illegal pollution. However, economic tourism as another perspective, by comparing costs and benefits over time, like reporting pollution, uh, costs through cleanups, government fines, lower profits. But however, allowing pollution continue could eventually cost more through lawsuits, medical expenses by people getting sick, environmental restoration by the trees being damaged and plant life being damaged. And it also is going to damage the company reputation because this company is going to be known for harming the environment, harming people, and it's just not a good look. And by looking beyond short-term profits, reporting pollution, creates a long-term outcome. Instead of just only looking at the profits and stuff, look at the damages that it's doing. That's what I'm trying to say. That's why I feel like Dan should report it, because yes, the company is making more money, but look at the long-term effects. People are getting sick. People are getting, cancers. People are going to get sick eventually. And I feel like that's more important, and instead of the company getting profits, make sure the people are good. And my next slide is rural tourism or indirect or direct tourism. And rural tourism asks what general rule will create the greatest good if everyone follow it. So what role will be great if everyone follow it? And I feel like in this case, a strong rule would be that employees should report environmental violation. They should report when they see something going wrong or harming people. They should report that. Like, think about it. If every employee ignored pollution because it wasn't in the job description or they don't get paid enough to do that, companies could continue breaking the laws, wild consequences, and people could still continue getting sick, and our public trust that the company had would disappear. Whereas, on the other hand, if employees consistently reported, these, misconduct or these issues, I feel like businesses would have much stronger sensitive to follow the law, because they kept getting told like, hey, you're getting people sick, and businesses eventually gonna have to say something because the government gonna step in, or they gonna get fines and stuff, and the business gonna eventually have to follow this rule. Um, and I feel like even though following this rule may create personal difficulties for Dan, I feel like it's still gonna benefit, because, for example, I feel like a good ethical rule: employees should report serious environmental violations. And I feel like if everyone stays silent, I feel like illegal pollution will increase. Companies going to avoid accountability. They just going to deny, deny, deny. And I feel like public trust would decrease. They're like, hey, people are getting sick. For example, we're going to be like, hey, we're getting sick. We're getting sick. And the company does not care because nobody's speaking up. The company is going to keep denying, and people are still going to be outraged. But I feel like if everyone reported the wrongdoing, businesses would start following, environmental laws. Communities stay safer. It won't be getting sick at all. And I feel like public confidence is going to be better in the business. People are going to start trusting the company more. Like, okay, they actually, you know, doing things because we've been reporting. They actually trying to increase, not getting people sick and stuff like that. I feel like if everybody reported the wrongdoing, this won't be an issue. Dumping stuff in a lake would not be an issue. And onto my second to last slide. I feel like what could be a counter argument. As much as I'm saying Dan should report it and Dan shouldn't be silent. The counter argument: Dan could be silent. And some of the pros of Dan being silent could be risk losing his career. If he speak up, he can lose his job. Staying silent, he can keep his job, keep getting that money. Um, Staying silent, employees may lose their job. If Dan speaks up, employees can lose a job. Whereas staying silent, employees keep their jobs, keep their welfare, keep whatever they need. And if Dan's opens up, the company could experience fines, could experience backlash, could experience, at the worst hand, bankruptcy, because they got exposed for getting people sick and dumping illegal waste, toxic waste into lakes, which could be very, very, very bad for that company. And but my thing is also, when doing this, it's important to consider, opposing viewpoints. For example, like Dan, he's not an environmental inspector. At the end of the day, his job is a council accountant, and it's not his job to speak up or say anything. But he should, because we learned in chapter 4, jurism requires us to compare the overall consequences. Instead of look at it from both sides. Yes, the company is saving money, but the long run, people are getting sick. People are eventually going to die because of this, and the harm caused by continued mercury pollution affects far more people than financial losses and experienced by the company. And I feel like remaining silent pretty much allows the harm to continue the company pollution and stuff, and getting people sick. But however, reporting, I feel like, protects the public and protects the people, and it helps the people not become sick. And I feel like it's better to expose the corruption instead of just staying silent. And my last slide is my decision, and should Dan blow the whistle? That last question for you guys. My decision is Dan should blow the whistle. The reason I say why he should blow the whistle is, like, after examining this case through the theories that we discussed in chapter 4, I believe Dan should report the illegal dumping, because, for example, like, direct jurism shows that reporting creates the greatest overall good by protecting the communities and the environment. And what I learned is from preference-based jurism, pretty much reminds us that most informed people would prefer clean water and not have toxic waste dumping into their links. I think that's just what most people would do. And what I also learned too, economic jurism demonstrates that while reporting creates short-term costs, it prevents much larger financial environmental consequences in the future. And then my last one, rural jurism, that I learned as well. It supports a rule that pretty much encourages employees to report, like, serious wrong things and serious wrongdoings, because I feel like it creates a safer and more ethical place. And also, by employees, like, speaking up, it can stop corruption in companies, and I feel like that can really, really help society nowadays. But my thing is, although Dan risks his career and can lose his job, I feel like the benefit is way better than the company's benefits. I feel like speaking up about corruption and speaking up about how people are getting sick, how people can get sick, whereas the company want to save money, I feel like it's more important to protect the people than the company. And I pretty much thank y'all for listening to me, and I look forward to any questions that you guys may have me. Sorry about this kind of being long, and sorry about my yapping and stuff. I'm kind of sick right now, but I appreciate you guys listening. If you have any questions, please just let me know in the description, and I'll be happy to answer them. Also, my last question before I end this video: should Dan blow the whistle? After hearing from everything I said, hearing the pros, hearing the cons, should Dan blow the whistle or should he not? And just let me know. And I thank you guys.